Today we have some more actual history about traditions among Native Americans about the little people of Wyoming. We will hear about the legends of these little people and how they would snatch Indian babies if their mother left them unattended. We will also hear about a verified find of a mummified skeleton in a cave in the Pedro Mountains of Wyoming in the 1930s that some say is from an ancient race of little people, while others claim it is only a young or stillborn human baby. We will be reading from the April 1983 issue of True West magazine. The article is titled, "The Mysterious Little People, Evidence Found They Existed in Wyoming." Interestingly, an individual author is not listed for this article. After we read this article from True West magazine, we will then read a short newspaper article from the Casper Star Tribune, published in 1947. This article tells about the inspection of the mummy by some local scientists and about its last known owner in 1950, Ivan Goodman, before the mummy disappeared. So here's the story of the mysterious little people of Wyoming. One of the unsolved mysteries of the Old West is what happened to the little people. Dorothy M. Johnson, Montana author, summed it up best when she wrote, "I don't mind walking under ladders and I like black cats, but I wouldn't for anything offend the little people." Dorothy, like the Crow Indians and others, believes the little people may still exist. The Crows occasionally leave small gifts for them in the Pryor Mountains of Montana. The only trouble is that, like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, no one has ever seen the little people. But unlike Bigfoot, in Wyoming they believe they have discovered the body of a little person. They've thought so for many years, and while it may not be the warm body sought in most detective cases, at least it's a body. John A. Bonar of Glen Rock, Wyoming, tells how in 1969, Bud Williams, owner of the Wardrobe Cleaners in Casper, Wyoming, told him of a little man's head on display in a shop in Casper. Richard Phelps, an orthopedic specialist, displayed the little head and claimed it came from the race of little people, or savages which may have predated North American Indians. Phelps said evidence points to the ancient existence of these cannibalistic people living in Wyoming. Several adult mummies have been found, 3 of which can be documented, along with 7 severed heads. Dr. Barnum Brown, known as the father of dinosaurs because of his discoveries of prehistoric monsters, claimed to have evidence of a small race of people who lived in the Shell Canyon area of Wyoming. The famed paleontologist was working for the New York Museum of Natural History when he discovered the huge Diplodocus, used later as a trademark of Sinclair Oil Company. Ivan Goodman, a Casper used car salesman, had a complete skeleton of a little person. Bonar remembers the horrible photo of it in the Casper newspaper in the late 1940s. Goodman took the mummy back to New York. It was then scheduled to be featured in Robert Ripley's nationally syndicated column, Believe It or Not. Ivan Goodman died from a brain tumor shortly after. A Casper librarian claims to have information that a Leonard Wadler of New York City acquired the mummy for study. It was never returned to the Goodman family, which spent much money after Ivan's death on attorneys and trips to New York trying to recover the relic. In 1968, Earl Nightingale of the radio program Our Changing World broadcast a strange story written by Frank Edwards. It was taken from Edwards' book, Stranger Than Fiction. In 1932, a couple of gold prospectors named Frank Carr and Cecil Maine worked in the Pedro Mountains, 60 miles west of Casper. They blasted a solid granite rock. When the smoke and dust had settled, the miners peered into the opening. They got the shock of their lives, for peering right back at them was an ugly, tiny mummy of a man-like creature in a cave 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 15 feet deep. He was on a tiny ledge, legs crossed and sitting on his feet. His strong-looking arms were folded in his lap. He was dark brown, deeply wrinkled, and his face was monkey-like in some respects. The prospectors carefully wrapped him in a small blanket. They took him back to Casper. Here the news of their discovery attracted much attention. Local scientists were interested, but they were skeptical. But X-rays showed unmistakably that here was a creature that had been man-like, and its small skull, the spine vertebrae, rib cage, and arm and leg bones were sharply discernible. He had been less than 20 inches tall, his forehead was low, and a flat nose with large nostrils preceded a wide mouth with canine-like teeth. At the time of death, he was said to be about 65 years old. According to the radio program, the anthropological department of Harvard University claimed that there was no doubt as to the genuineness of the mummy, and two experts of the American Museum of Natural History revealed that their x-rays showed a small skeletal structure covered by dried skin. It is smaller than any known human types, and the supposition developed that it might be a form of anthropoid which roamed the North American continent about 5 million years ago in the Pliocene age. A Wyoming travelogue printed in 1940 says that the skeletons of a race of little people encased in solid rock extends as far north as the Yellowstone River, and have been found buried in caves near the Colorado line. Legends of these ferocious pygmies may be found among the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Crow Indians. A group of interested scientists is seeking a cave in the vastness of the Bighorn Mountains, where 5 of these mummies are said to be buried, cross-legged on an ancient ledge. However, these mummies have no connection to an ancient Indian ritual of depriving a skeleton of flesh, and the bones disjointed so the bones could be packed in a small space. This led to a false belief that there was an ancient race of pygmies where they were found in the Mound region of Tennessee. Nor is the tiny man found in the Pedro Mountains the only evidence of the legend of the little people. The Crows' little people like us human beings if we behave properly, Dorothy Johnson wrote in the Billings Gazette. But the Snakes and Bannocks know about a different tribe of miniature beings that don't seem to like anybody, except to eat. She said these creatures are called Nunumbi, or Nunumbi, or sometimes Little Yellow Men. Granville Stewart, one of Montana's pioneers, told about them in his 40 Years on the Frontier. In the Salmon River Mountains there lives in caves among the rocks a race of fairies about 2 feet high, who, with bow in hand and arrow case slung on their backs, go out and hunt and kill sheep, deer, elk, and antelope, which they carry home on their backs. They eat the flesh, and their wives dress the skins, from which they make themselves clothes, while the men go entirely naked. Now whenever the Indians are in their vicinity, and a woman goes out for wood, and happens to lay her infant down and gets out of sight of it, one of these fairies immediately devours it, and taking its place begins to cry at a terrible rate. The woman, hearing the child, as she supposes, crying, returns and, taking it up, gives it to suck to pacify it, when it instantly seizes her by the breast, and commences devouring it. Dorothy Johnson said that she saw one of the little people once, but it was dead. As she put it, dead but menacing. She said it was found in 1933 by 2 young men in the Wind River Mountains. They had been prospecting for gold on their day off from the Civilian Conservation Corps. Apparently these are the same 2 as referred to by Frank Edwards and quoted by Earl Nightingale. She notes that one of the men who came into possession of it 2 months later died of a brain tumor. In any case, she said it about 25 years ago in New York, after much correspondence with the man who had it, and who was trying valiantly to get it identified by some reputable scientist. Most of them kept telling him, "There is no such thing, go away." Dorothy said x-rays showed that it was not a baby, it had sharp teeth. One lock of hair was still attached, which was said to be human but not Indian. The thing emanated evil, she concluded. She said the 2 who discovered the creature died soon after. A long list of others associated with it also died or had severe illnesses. She said a year after she saw it, she was involved in a highway accident that severely injured her and another person. She wanted nothing more to do with it, she said. Mrs. Winifred Caldwell, a teacher in Alcover, Wyoming, told John Bonar that her husband had loaned a university professor one of the small mummies found in the area. It was a horrible-looking thing and was never returned. I am glad, she said. Several others have said that they found skulls or mummies. James Reynolds of Casper was in a party which he said found several small skulls in local mountain country. Jose Martinez, a Mexican sheep herder, said he found a whole mummy and 6 skulls while herding sheep on a local ranch. He said the find so jinxed his horse and his sheep that he replaced the mummy and the skulls and the spell was broken. In Montana's Beartooth Mountains, while herding sheep, Bill Street, father of the late Sheriff Roy Street of Casper Mountain, tells of finding small skulls in 1922, as well as whole mummies. Street said scientists told him that a dwarf people existed before the Ice Age. Ella Clark, in her book, Indian legends from the northern Rockies tells of cannibalistic little people as having big stomachs and who were powerfully built. They used sign language unknown to Indians. An Arapaho Indian spokesman at Riverton, Wyoming, confirmed that the Arapahoes could not contact the little people through sign language, and were very much frightened of them. Such tales were also handed down within Indian tribes in western Montana. The Flatheads believed that the little people lived underground. But because of rumored mysterious deaths or ailments associated with the little people, no one in the West is much willing to talk about them. So that's it for this story about the mysterious little people of Wyoming, published in the April 1983 issue of True West magazine. I am now going to read a newspaper article from the July 31st, 1947 issue of the Casper Star-Tribune. This article is titled, "Doc Works Over Oldest Patient," by Irving Garbett. It tells about one of the experts who inspected the mummy when it was owned by Ivan Goodman. Dr. Gordon Whiston of Casper treated the oldest patient in the state of Wyoming this week, but there seemed little hope of recovery. X-ray pictures showed the little man had suffered a broken collarbone, and it didn't take an X-ray to show that the top of his head had been bashed in. Dr. Whiston and Dr. J. F. Replogle of Lander, who assisted him, had a little difficulty with the history of the case. Not much was known concerning Little Mongo, for want of any other name, except that he had squatted on his haunches in a sealed cave in the Pedro Mountains southwest of Casper for Lord knows how many eons, and had come to light in 1932 when a gold seeker set off a blast which opened the entrance to the cave. Ordinarily, information about patients is sacrosanct and can't be revealed, but in this case Mongo won't mind. The two physicians wanted the X-rays in order to study the bone structure of the wizened little mummy, no bigger than the palm of your hand, 6.5 inches in squatting position. X-rays taken by Eastern universities indicated that the diminutive human was an adult, and not a fetus as some skeptics had contended. Little Mongo wasn't saying anything. He continued to stare inscrutably out of glazed eyes at a collection of used cars in the parking lot operated by Ivan Goodman, his present and fourth owner. He stared rudely back at people who inspected him and declared, "I wouldn't have him for an ancestor." Squatting with arms folded, head bowed slightly, legs in a semi-kneeling position, and gazing straight ahead, Mongo seemed to say, "I don't claim you as a descendant either." Mongo has a unique place. The anthropologists can't find a place for him in their theories of evolution. They can't locate the right rung in the ladder of evolution. Yet they cannot deny that he existed, and has the anatomy of a human, just about the right bone structure. Even the features are similar to those found today. He has a broad, flat nose like an Indian. Mongo looks like some people you know. It's a lot easier to reconcile the little man with legendary history. Almost any race of people have legends about little people. The Irish have their leprechauns and pixies. The ancient Greeks their dryads. And even aviators in the war spoke of gremlins. The older Indians, of which few remain, have talked of a little people in the mountains called sheep-eaters, which were killed by other tribes long before the advent of the white man, Dr. Replogle recalled. Mongo might have been a sheep-eater, but it looks like he might have been scalped. The wizened little mummy has traveled a great deal since he was yanked from his ancient sanctum in a settled cave in the Pedro Mountains. Unfortunately, he left no tools, drawings on the walls, or artifacts of any kind as a clue to his identity. Since his release from a ledge in the cave, he's had 4 owners, none of whom have learned the secret of his past. No question about the creature's rarity, said the anthropological department at Harvard University. Other Eastern universities and the Smithsonian Institute were impressed by the find. One scientist even gave him a name, Hesperopithecus, after a form of anthropoid which roamed the North American continent in the middle of the Pliocene period. All of them said it is the most perfect prehistoric mummy ever discovered. The mummy was exhibited in a field museum in Chicago, and even traveled with a carnival for a time. Mr. Goodman says he has had offers to buy the little man, but has declined them all. If the used car business goes to pot one of these days, we may take a trip together, he said. Meanwhile, you can look at Mongo without charge at the Central Auto Court, and decide for yourself if you feel any kinship, however remote. So that's the end of this newspaper article from the Casper Star-Tribune in 1947. Mr. Goodman was the last known owner of the mummy, and he displayed it in his used car lot office and would put ads in the local newspaper to tell the public that they could come and view it. I am now going to read a section of this article published on wyohistory.org on November 8, 2014, written by Rebecca Hine. It is titled, The Pedro Mountain Mummy, and it tells what became of the mummy after Ivan Goodman suddenly died in New York in 1950. The Pedro Mountain mummy was discovered in June 1934 by two gold prospectors in the Pedro Mountains approximately 60 miles southwest of Casper, Wyoming. Contrary to the mythology of the nearly 8 decades that have passed since its discovery, the mummy was almost certainly a human baby, not a tiny adult from the Pliocene epoch, or from the race of little people of American Indian lore. Photographs and a signed affidavit leave little doubt that the discovery itself was real. The affidavit, dated November 13, 1936, and signed by Cecil Main, one of the prospectors, states that the mummy was found in a sealed cave, on a rock ledge about 2½ feet from the ground. There was nothing else in the cave. The affidavit further states that the mummy was now owned by Homer F. Sherrill, and located in the Field Museum in Chicago, Illinois. The affidavit was sworn in Scottsbluff County, Nebraska, and subsequently recorded in Hot Springs County, Wyoming, on August 16, 1943. From the time of its discovery until it was lost in 1950, the mummy traveled a path that will probably never be possible to document fully. An article by Penelope Purdy in the Casper Star-Tribune, dated July 21, 1979, states that the two prospectors took the mummy back to Casper with them as a curiosity. Although they were ridiculed for perpetrating a hoax, the body made the rounds of local sideshows in a glass bottle. Lou Musser wrote in a March 30, 1950 article for the Casper Tribune-Herald that the mummy for years has been the center of much controversy locally. Musser notes that before it was purchased by Ivan Goodman, a Casper businessman, it was displayed by a prior owner in the Jones Drug Store in Meeteetse, Wyoming. Although Musser does not name either the Meeteetse owner nor the price Goodman paid, Purdy mentions a selling price of several $1,000s. In a related article dated July 24, 1979, Purdy names the Meeteetse owner Floyd Jones. If the affidavit was dated in the same year as the discovery, both Purdy's 1979 article as well as Musser's from 1950 have errors. Purdy states that the mummy was found in October of 1932, according to local legend. Musser reports that a sheep herder discovered it, naming no dates. To further confuse matters, an October 21, 1977 newspaper article, Macaulay's, Wyoming, also from the Casper Star-Tribune, and obviously written somewhat tongue-in-cheek, claims, Goodman said he bought the Pedro Mountain Man from the sheep herder. This article also mentions that the sheep herder discovered it. The mythical sheep herder is not named in any of the articles that refer to him. Even the sworn claim that the mummy was at the Field Museum is open to question. Archivist Armand Assay notes that the Field Museum has no record of the mummy's presence during that time. The item still could have been there on loan or for identification, but because it was not part of the museum's official collection, the mummy was not listed in the records. Thus, facts discovered after the recording of the affidavit are sketchy, but Ivan Goodman's ownership by 1950 is certain. This was confirmed by his son Dixon Goodman of Casper. The elder Goodman took the mummy to Dr. Henry Shapiro, curator of biological anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Shapiro examined it, took x-rays, and sent the films around that time to George Gill, then professor of biological anthropology at the University of Wyoming. Gill has confirmed that he received those x-rays and that he and Shapiro agreed that the mummy was almost certainly a human baby, either stillborn or dead shortly after birth. This child probably died of anencephaly, the congenital absence of a large part of the brain. Later in 1950, when Goodman traveled to New York a second time, he took the mummy to a man named in 3 articles as Leonard Wadler. Purdy's July 24, 1979 article mentioned above, plus another by her dated October 9, 1990, and one by John Bonar in the 62nd Annual Wyoming Chronicle, dated March 23, 1980. Bonar adds that a Casper librarian claims that Wadler acquired the mummy for study. All 3 articles state that shortly after taking the mummy to Wadler, Goodman was taken ill and died. The mummy was never returned to Goodman's family, and has not been seen again. So that's it for this episode about the mysterious little people of Wyoming. These were called Nunumbi or Nimerigar by the Shoshones and the Paiutes. This website, nativelanguages.org, has an entry for Nunumbi that I will now read. Although benign races of small magical creatures exist in many Native American tribes, the little people of the Shoshone and Paiute tribes are dangerous man-eaters and enemies of humankind. Nimerigar is a corruption of the Shoshone and Paiute words that mean people-eaters, and Nunumbi means little person. In addition to this mummy found in the Pedro Mountains, there were claims of other skeletons that were discovered in other places in Wyoming and in Montana, including the writer Dorothy Johnson, who claims that she once saw the body of a little person. In the 1909 book, Centennial History of Coshocton County, Ohio, there is an account of the discovery by the Moravian clergyman Zeisberger of numerous signs of an ancient race, near a mound 3 miles south of Coshocton. He found several skeletons that were between 3 and 4.5 feet tall in length. There is also an emerging consensus in the scientific community that a small pygmy species known as Homo Florensiensis once existed, and it was probably an offshoot of Homo erectus or Homo ergaster. The first skeleton was found around 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores. The skeletons were very small, between 3 and 4 feet tall, and they were found in caves. One thing to note is that both the skeletons found in Ohio near the Mounds and those discovered in Indonesia were about 3 to 4 feet in length, whereas the mummy found in the Pedro Mountains was only about 18 inches tall. It's possible that these little people like Homo Florensiensis once existed, and they lived in North America, but that the Pedro Mountain mummy really was just a human baby with anencephaly. So what do you think? Did these little people once exist? And was this a skeleton of one found in the Pedro Mountains in the 1930s? Or was this skeleton just a human baby, possibly with anencephaly? Let us know in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV and unworthy to display in our modern museums. If you'd like to support our mission here at Unworthy History, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Members will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to our members-only videos that we occasionally release. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.